Muito bem, pessoal, estamos de volta com a nossa cobertura oficial da NAFA Virtual Experience 2021. Para quem não pôde acompanhar, tivemos um conteúdo sobre indicadores pela manhã, mas se você perdeu, é só procurar aqui no nosso YouTube que a gente deixa tudo gravado, ok? Agora a gente vai entrar em mais um tema que com certeza já passou pela sua cabeça desde que a pandemia começou, que é a renovação da frota. Planejamento, análise de crédito, que essas coisas são importantes, todo mundo já sabe, né? Agora, com a questão da crise, uma coisa muito importante desse tipo de projeto que saiu de cena é o timing certo para fazer essa troca, levando em conta a depreciação dos veículos, né, e tudo mais. Por isso, o tema da próxima palestra é Quando o atraso na substituição da frota é infelizmente inevitável. Então vocês vão ouvir a Kate Vigneault, diretora de Frotas na Matrix Consulting Group, 5 passos para se adequar a essa realidade. Aliás, uma curiosidade, a Kate já participou de várias edições da nossa Conferência Global PARAR em anos anteriores, presencialmente aqui no Brasil. E ela é uma super fã nossa, diz que somos uma grande inspiração para a NAFA, né? No sentido de ter a segurança dos condutores como um grande propósito do Instituto PARAR. Muito bacana, né? Com vocês, Kate Vigneault em Quando o atraso na substituição da frota é infelizmente inevitável.
Welcome, everyone, to NAFA's 2021 I&E Virtual Experience and our session today, When Delayed Fleet Replacement is Unfortunately Inevitable. I am Catherine Vigneault, CAFM, and I am the Director of Fleet for Matrix Consulting Group. I'm going to be the moderator and the speaker for today's session. All right, and with that, I'd like to jump into my presentation today. So fleet professionals understand the economics of fleet, as I like to call it, and that there's an optimum replacement time for every vehicle class in a given use profile. Optimum replacement, however, can only really happen if you have the budget to do it. And with COVID-induced budget shortages, the funds may not be there for optimum fleet replacement. So fleet professionals must be very flexible and be ready to make informed decisions on fleet replacement by following a 5-step process that I'm going to get into in a few moments. Here's a little bit of an intro slide for me. So my name's Kate Vigneault, CAFM. I am now the director for Fleet for Matrix Consulting Group, as well as being the director for Canada of MCG Consulting Solutions. So Matrix and its partner MCG Consulting do consulting mostly in the government and public organizational sectors. And they do not only fleet, but also a full realm of other government services, including police, fire, facility, financial, you name it. I previously spent 27 years in the Canadian Army, where at one point I was the fleet manager for the Canadian Armed Forces, and I've served all over the world. I have been involved with NAFA for just over 20 years, and as a volunteer in many capacities in education. And then for about a decade, I was the director of professional development, responsible for the coordination of NAFA's education and certification programs. So over a career in the industry spanning over 30 years, I learned a lot about fleet replacement, some of which I recently had to relearn. I divided my presentation today into 3 sections. So first of all, I'm going to talk about what I like to call the economics of fleet, and one of the most important slides in the fleet industry. Next up, I'm going to present what are my own 5 steps of what I'm calling informed delayed fleet replacement. And finally, I'm going to offer you 2 case studies that I've recently come across and some solutions. So yes, this presentation is designed for fleet managers, but it's very relevant for the decision makers, senior executives or city councils, and can be used to inform and educate them. And so here it is, the economic theory of fleet replacement. I think most fleet professionals understand the optimum replacement and how it works towards making sure that you have the lowest total cost of ownership. It's pretty intuitive that those capital costs decrease when they're spread over a longer period of time. And operating costs, shown here in yellow, increase as a vehicle gets older because it's less fuel efficient and it normally requires more maintenance. So wherever possible, vehicles should be replaced when the TCO is lowest. So when the total of operating and capital costs are the lowest, or at the bottom of this U-shaped total cost curve here. Many organizations use available technology to calculate that optimum replacement point for various classes of equipment, and hence their yearly budget needs. Many fleets right now are to the right of that dotted line on that total cost curve where it's starting to sharply increase. That's a real difficult position to be in, and it's a difficult position to recover from. So let's break down these costs a little before we get into some solutions. This is how NAFA Fleet Management Association breaks up or categorizes costs. So TCO, or total cost of ownership, is a combination of all of your fixed costs of running your fleet operation, all of the operating costs, as well as the minor little day-to-day incidental costs. I'm going to look at each of these in turn. So first up are fixed costs. Fixed costs include all of the following. The best way to look at them is that these fixed costs are incurred whether the vehicle moves or not. So this would include fleet salaries and benefits, facility costs, and then the interest, insurance, and depreciation of the vehicles themselves. If you ever wonder whether a cost should be categorized as fixed or operating, ask yourself whether that cost goes up if the vehicle moves. If the answer to that is yes, then it's an operating cost. Typical operating costs include fuel and maintenance. Now, what about collision repair? There's lots of debate on that one. So ask yourself, do crash costs increase as you travel more miles? Well, they may, but not really at a predictable rate. So crash repair is an operating cost. It wouldn't happen if the vehicle was just simply parked, but it should always be captured separately from your other operating costs. And that's so that you can attribute it back to the organization responsible for those crash repair costs, and it really enhances their accountability. And then, as I said, incidentals are the minor costs associated with fines, car washing, and tolls, but they can add up. So some best practices here: obviously, fines should always be charged back to the driver, to the person responsible for incurring the fine. Car wash, it's so important that, you should never be scrimping there, especially in the winter months in countries like Canada or in the northern states. because removing that brine and snow from the vehicle can really extend its life. And then of course, tolls. To bring these different costs together, I wanted to show you this life cycle analysis equation. First, what are the personal use payments referred to here? So these apply in organizations usually with assigned take-home vehicles. So then in those situations, a portion of the use of those vehicles would be commuting or other personal use. And increasingly, organizations are tracking those costs and recovering them from the individual benefiting from them. The second thing I wanted to mention here is, how does a life cycle cost analysis relate to TCO? Do we use those terms interchangeably, or do they have slightly different meanings? So life cycle cost analysis, or LCA, is a methodology to determine TCO, total cost of ownership, or total life cycle costs of owning that asset. So the LCA is the methodology, and the life cycle cost, or TCO, is the end result. So in essence, we calculate life cycle costs by starting with the acquisition cost of the asset, add in all the fixed costs, add in all those operating costs, back out or subtract the personal use payments if you do claw those payments back from the driver, and that results in life cycle costs. And of course, we want to replace vehicles when that life cycle cost is at the lowest. Naturally, optimal replacement can only happen if an organization is able to dedicate sufficient budget for fleet. The best laid replacement plans fail the first year that funding is not forthcoming. And I can recall putting an ideal system in place when I was fleet manager. And I did have some funding up front to make up a bit of the backlog in fleet replacement. And so I brought my fleet basically into life cycle. And at that time, I had a large fleet. And so I could buy vehicles off standing offer for very, very reasonable prices, below market prices. I could run those vehicles for 3 to 4 years with excellent maintenance, PMs, preventative maintenance, under vehicle warranty. And at that point, I could actually sell them at auction for almost what I paid. So my yearly requirement, annual requirement for capital funding was very, very small. So put together a business case. The funding was agreed to first year, second year, third year, it all went well. Fourth year, funds dried up. I couldn't get my replacement funding. So the program falls apart at that point, because you get into a situation where you then need to catch up, and it's the catching up that becomes really difficult. So in a perfect world, all fleet professionals would adhere to these optimum life cycles and minimize their TCO over their multi-year replacement plans. Well, the global pandemic has meant for most organizations that it's far from a perfect world. Organizational budgets have been redirected to accommodate the purchase of PPE, personal protective equipment, increased cleaning of vehicles and work areas, workplace modifications, putting in plexiglass, enhanced technology to allow for work from home, and many more COVID-induced changes. So these funds have to come from somewhere. And a lot of the time, it's the fleet replacement budget that looks like an attractive target. Decision makers often see delaying fleet replacement as an easy out, as the impacts of that decision aren't going to be felt for many years in the future. So diverting those fleet replacement funds to higher operational priorities may be inevitable in your organization. Although this tendency towards delayed replacement is not new, it is exacerbated by the current COVID crisis, and fleet managers are being asked to delay fleet replacement normally when times are tough, and that includes today. Those fleet managers need to ensure that decision makers fully understand both the short and long-term impacts of these delays, and that there are other viable alternatives to delaying fleet replacement. However, once the final decision is made to delay replacement through reduction of fleet budgets, fleet managers must then make informed decisions that minimize the impacts. And this is what I like to call informed delayed replacement and the 5 steps thereof. Yeah, there's no ideal situation here. Inevitably, fleet professionals have to act counter to what they know is best practice to meet priority goals of the organization. In this and other cases where delayed replacement is inevitable, fleet managers should take these steps to ensure that informed delayed replacement takes place. So it's not the ideal, but it's better than an ad hoc approach. So you've got to understand what exactly the budget reduction is. You've got to know the short and long-term costs and other impacts. You have to make an attempt to educate decision makers on those impacts. If possible, explore other less costly alternatives. And then when you get to the bottom line, be as judicious as you can in implementing delayed replacement. And I want to look at each of these steps in some detail. Understanding the budget reduction. In large organizations, it can take some time for information to be communicated. Rumors of the budget cuts may hit the fleet office before any official announcements. The onus really is on that fleet manager to understand the formal decision and what the reduction is to either their capital or operating funds or both. And they should be ready at all times to perform what-if analysis and offer alternatives up that are the best for the organization. Ideally, though, the fleet manager is involved in budget discussions throughout and can ensure that the impacts of any potential reductions are known even before a final budget decision is made. In addition to understanding the potential impacts, the fleet manager should be proactively evaluating what that could mean. A decision to cut replacement funding has both short-term and longer-term consequences. The fleet manager should definitely evaluate the immediate impact on operating costs and service delivery. We all know that keeping vehicles longer means that fuel and maintenance costs are going to go up. Maintenance needs may actually exceed the ability of the organization to do the maintenance in-house, in which case you would need to plan for outsourcing. If there are additional cuts to operating funds, that may limit the ability to do in-house or outsourced repairs, which then impacts downtime. As vehicle downtime increases, naturally the services that an organization is able to provide will be diminished. In addition, having vehicles that are less than fully fit for service may have an impact on driver, operator morale, and even on the image of the organization. The next step in the process, once you've fully evaluated what the short and longer term impacts might be, really is to educate decision makers. And you want to explain to them what is happening to fleet, how you can mitigate against it, and even give them examples of models that show different what-if scenarios. All fleet professionals should be proactively quantifying the impacts in order to provide this type of information to decision makers. They should be able to paint a clear picture that short-term impacts will grow exponentially over time, and that every year that replacement funding is insufficient, the hole gets deeper and more difficult to make up. You should be reminding decision makers that a $2 million decrease to fleet funding today could easily result in a higher total cost of ownership of your assets by twice that within a 5 to 10 year period. Fleet managers should always be using models to clearly demonstrate the short and long-term impacts of delaying fleet replacement. And here's your last Hail Mary. You want to be exploring other options. So maybe the decision makers haven't considered some other ways to make up for the reductions in fleet budget. So here are some possibilities. Knowing that delays to fleet replacement are only going to postpone the inevitable, organizations should ask tough questions about whether a program or service could be discontinued to achieve permanent savings. For example, could garbage service be reduced to every 2 weeks instead of weekly? Could library hours or recreational facility hours be reduced? One example that I came across on a fleet consulting project is a fleet that was regularly, after every snow event, removing the windrows at the end of driveways. It was part of the customer service that they were providing. However, a number of years of reduced capital funding had them in a serious situation with regards to replacement of their snowplow fleet. And they were able to do an analysis that determined that the cost of plowing windrows after every snow event was in the order of $3 million. That was a very good example of a savings, a real-time savings that could be made. Of course, it had to be communicated properly to citizens so that they understood why those choices were being made. But it was a more favorable alternative to delaying fleet replacement. Any of these solutions that I mentioned mean reduction of service or service levels, but they do translate into real savings. Before even suggesting that kind of service level reduction, however, fleet professionals have to make sure that their house is in order. And one of the ways to do that is a fleet utilization or right sizing review, which means you want to make sure that you don't have more equipment than you actually need and that you're not replacing units that are lightly or not being used at all. Other options, you could consider purchasing used vehicles, and then other mobility options such as rentals, mobility allowance to workers, even the use of public transit. If you're able to demonstrate that you have in fact explored some of these other options and adopted some of these other strategies, it may make your argument against delayed fleet replacement more compelling. All right, so next up is implement. So now we're in a situation where you've done your best to evaluate options and educate the decision makers, and you have a final decision. This is what your budget allocation is going to be. So even after explaining the economics of fleet and exploring all these alternatives, some organizations are going to proceed with replacement funding reductions. Once that decision is made, fleet managers need to carefully plan and execute and make the best decisions possible under those circumstances. One way to do that is through the use of a sophisticated points system that takes into account factors such as the age of the vehicle, the mileage of the vehicle, the maintenance spend annually and cumulative spend to date, as well as the condition of the vehicle. And by allocating points, you can identify which vehicles truly should be prioritized for replacement when funds are going to be short. So simply abandoning your multi-year replacement plan is not an answer. You should stick to that plan as closely as possible using a prioritized point system, and then make changes to that plan to reflect the new reality. And once you've made those adjustments to the plan, decision makers should be informed of the impact on costs and the risks associated with further reductions. So with those 5 steps in mind, let's now turn to 2 case studies that I encountered recently and illustrate their solutions, resolutions that may work for some of you. All right, so let's look at this first model. This is a case where a fleet manager is living a very difficult reality. They had had a number of years of devastating fires, followed by floods, and actually had replacement funding reduced to 0 in 2 of the past 5 years. Well, enter COVID, and that organization was facing another year of $0 in replacement funding. The organization really needed to find another option. And so they engaged us to model several different options. And here's the 4 different models that we came up with. The first one, and starting at the top here, we learned if we kept the capital spending at the 2021 level, that the overall total cost of ownership over the next 10 years would exceed $100 million. And you see that on the blue line. In the next option, we would spend each year the average of the last 5-year spend, capital spend, and that would bring the TCO somewhere down under $70 million. Next up would be to figure out the annual amount that we would have to spend in capital in order to keep the vehicles at their same age. So in this case, the fleet was 11.1 years average age, which is more than we like to see. That's older than industry best practice. But still, if we wanted to keep those vehicles at that age, we could spend a certain amount of capital, and we could make the TCO in 10 years come to around $45 million. But then finally, if we spent enough to bring every vehicle class into their recommended life cycle, then the TCO, which of course includes those capital and operating costs, would be just under $40 million. So yeah, spending more upfront results in a much lower spend over the lifetime of the fleet. So this modeling actually resulted in an increase to the zero funding anticipated for this year. And results for the future, however, remain to be seen. In another case, here's another example of how modeling can help you compare different scenarios. In this fleet, we looked at the difference between maintaining status quo replacement funding and its impact on total cost of ownership, and those are the red lines. And then we looked at a recommended plan that would bring the fleet within their recommended life cycles and minimize the total cost of ownership. And you can see over a 10-year period that the difference in the two scenarios is over $150 million. The other thing that is not quantified in this case study was operational degradation. And the client was actually able to determine that if the current funding models continued, they could no longer maintain their snowplow fleet, and that the reduction to the snowplow fleet would result in not being able to plow roads during major snow events. And they developed a model that further quantified some of the costs of that operational degradation. All of this was used and resulted in a large increase to capital funding, still not enough to bring it to optimum life cycles, but certainly enough to start turning the tide and stop digging the hole that they would not have been able to get out of. So to conclude, I've seen this approach succeed in making decision makers understand the problem and increase funding. And that's only possible if fleet professionals really understand the budget cuts, proactively evaluate the situation, short-term and long-term, continually educate senior managers and decision makers on implications, explore all other alternatives, and at the end of the day, always have a plan based on your multiple year replacement plan and condition assessments using point systems to implement your limited resources wisely to ensure informed delayed replacement. Thanks for joining us today, and I wish you all luck with informed delayed replacement.
Muito bem, pessoal, excelente esse último painel de hoje. Eu espero que essa bagagem, que a Kate trouxe possa te ajudar. E lembrando que no nosso último dia de cobertura, na quinta-feira, nossos parceiros aqui do Pará vão trazer uma mesa redonda com os principais destaques desse ciclo de palestras e conversas que nós estamos transmitindo aqui, beleza? Nossos convidados para bater um papo sobre os highlights da NAFA 2021 são o Sérgio Jabali, da GolSat, o Milad Calumi Neto, da Jato, e também o Ricardo Bacelar, da KPMG, beleza? Então nesse último dia nós vamos ter essa mesa sensacional com eles, vai estar imperdível. Gente, já marca lá na sua agenda, o link está aqui no chat também. E se você não puder acompanhar algum conteúdo desses 4 dias que a gente está transmitindo, aproveita já para se inscrever no canal do Instituto Parar, que todas as palestras vão ficar salvas na nossa playlist especial da cobertura da NAFA Virtual Experience 2021, beleza? Não custa lembrar, já estamos com as inscrições para a 7ª Conferência Global abertas, com muita novidade, muito conteúdo exclusivo lá na nossa conferência, para você que é gestor, que gosta de estudar, aumentar, aliás, o nível de eficiência da sua gestão. todo mundo que se inscrever na nossa Conferência Global PARAR vai ter 20% de desconto nos nossos cursos para gestores de frotas, tá? O PGF e a pós-graduação. É só acessar o link que nós estamos disponibilizando também agora aqui no chat. Eu vou ficando por aqui, amanhã eu te vejo novamente às 10 da manhã com o primeiro painel e às 16h30 com o segundo, beleza? Um forte abraço e até logo!